Welcome to the debate. Imagine being like the most observant, empathetic person in your entire office.
Right, the one who can just read a room instantly.
Exactly. You're the one who senses that slight shift in tone during a meeting, and you just intuitively know how to bridge the gap between frustrated colleagues. We are constantly told that this level of emotional intelligence is, well, it's a professional superpower.
Oh, absolutely. It's supposed to be the ultimate asset.
But what happens when that room is incredibly toxic? It is like having your radio receiver stuck on maximum volume in a room just full of static.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
Because a normal system might just filter it out, right? But a highly attuned system tries to decode all of that static until eventually the speaker's just below.
That is exactly the mechanism. And it doesn't just result in a bad day at the office. I mean, it fundamentally rewires how an individual functions.
Which brings us to the core of our discussion today. We're diving into Dr. Jonathan H. Westover's research on emotional intelligence in the workplace.
Right, and it's fascinating stuff.
It really is. For decades, the consensus has been that high emotional intelligence, or EI, is this ultimate professional asset. It predicts leadership effectiveness, it drives team cohesion, it boosts performance.
Yeah.
But Westover's research highlights this really devastating paradox. Within toxic organizational cultures, this incredible relational strength actually transforms into a severe personal liability.
Because these toxic workplaces, they operate entirely beneath the surface, We are not talking about a stressful quarter or like a project with tight resources.
No, it's much deeper.
Exactly. We are talking about persistent incivility, inconsistent accountability, and just these ambient climates of fear. And for those highly attuned employees, this environment doesn't just make them unhappy, it leads to actual neurobiological depletion.
Wait, neurobiological, like physical burnout?
Yes, because they are constantly scanning the environment for micro-expressions of frustration to smooth over, right? So their amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, it literally never gets to turn off.
Wow.
And that constant hypervigilance causes profound compassion fatigue and ultimately learned helplessness.
So, okay, if we agree on the mechanics of the damage here, the central question we really have to answer is, how do we stop the bleeding? When an organization's culture turns toxic and begins actively harming its most emotionally intelligent talent, what is the most effective intervention?
And that's where things get tricky.
Right. So, I will argue that cultivating compassionate leadership and enforcing top-down accountability is the absolute foundational lever for organizational repair. You simply cannot bypass the human element of leadership if you want to fix human suffering.
I come at it from a different way, actually. I argue that relying on individual leader virtue is a massive systemic vulnerability. The only reliable solution to toxicity is building leader-agnostic structural mechanisms.
Leader-agnostic?
Yeah, distributed accountability. Basically, if we want to safeguard this talent, we have to design physical and procedural systems that protect people entirely regardless of who happens to be sitting in the manager's chair.
Okay, well, let's unpack the leadership side first, because I look at this through the lens of human behavior. To me, leadership behavior is the single most powerful lever for preventing or remediating toxicity.
But is it reliable?
I think it's foundational. Look at the research by Jane Dutton and her colleagues. They don't define compassionate leadership as some vague personality trait.
Right.
They define it as a specific 4-step behavioral process. It requires noticing when people are struggling, interpreting that struggle as significant rather than just, an annoyance.
Sure.
And then feeling genuine concern and actually acting to alleviate it. That behavioral sequence is the prerequisite for psychological safety.
But doesn't that inherently prove how fragile the model is? I mean, you are relying on a manager to successfully execute 4 distinct emotional steps just to keep an employee safe.
It is demanding, yes, but it's necessary. If you try to implement structural interventions, like, say, anonymous reporting systems or feedback loops, without leaders who actually model vulnerability.
They still help, though.
Do they? Because without leaders integrating genuine concern with performance standards, those structures just become performative bureaucracy. I mean, employees see right through a slick HR portal if their boss is still a tyrant.
Well, I understand the appeal of the benevolent leader, but treating compassionate leadership as your primary solution creates a single point of failure in an organization.
How so?
Think about how toxic environments actually function. They thrive precisely on the ambiguity and power dynamics inherent in traditional hierarchies.
Okay, true.
Right? So if an employee's neurobiological well-being depends entirely on whether their specific manager has the emotional bandwidth to notice and interpret their struggle on a random Tuesday afternoon, they are inherently unsafe.
Hmm.
True psychological safety has to be infrastructural. We need to implement structural mechanisms such as regular safety measurement integrated into the workflow, independent reporting channels, and distributed authority.
So systems over people.
Systems that systematically protect high EI employees without needing a manager's emotional intelligence to activate them. Yes.
I hear that. But let's look at the nature of the harm these employees are actually experiencing. Because, the type of wound dictates the type of medicine.
Okay, fair enough.
We are dealing with neurobiological intensity here. Research by Eisenberger and Lieberman demonstrates that when humans perceive a social threat, like exclusion, humiliation, unfair treatment, the brain's anterior cingulate cortex lights up.
Right, that's the pain center.
Exactly. It is the exact same region that processes physical pain. The brain literally does not distinguish between a physical punch and severe social exclusion.
Right, and the cognitive load of constantly monitoring for that social threat is what drains the executive function.
Exactly. And because highly emotionally intelligent individuals process these relational dynamics more deeply, they frequently internalize this dysfunction as their own inadequacy.
Ah, the learned helplessness you mentioned earlier.
Right. A highly attuned person thinks, if I just communicate a little better, if I just show a bit more empathy, I can fix this dynamic. And when they inevitably fail because the system is toxic, their identity as a competent professional just shatters.
It's devastating.
Because this harm is so deeply relational and psychological, it demands a distinctly human intervention. A software system cannot sit down with a devastated employee, look them in the eye and say, "You are not crazy, the environment is broken." You need a human leader to reset their reality.
The psychological damage is very real, I'll give you that. But that neurobiological intensity is exactly why we cannot wait for a leader to happen to notice it.
What do you mean?
Look at the research on sensory processing sensitivity by Aaron and Aaron. They found that roughly 20% of the population has nervous systems that process social and emotional information much more deeply.
And that correlates with EI?
Emotionally intelligent people overlap significantly with this demographic, yeah. So when a full fifth of your workforce is structurally more vulnerable to the physical pain of toxicity, you cannot rely on serendipitous compassion.
Serendipitous compassion. That's an interesting phrase.
Well, it's true. This is exactly why institutions like the Cleveland Clinic created the Code Lavender program.
Right, their rapid response program for hospital staff.
Exactly. It was developed to address compassion fatigue among clinical staff, and it is a perfect example of a structural safety net. When a caregiver experiences a distressing situation, like, say, losing a patient, they don't have to wait for their shift supervisor to notice they look sad.
So what happens instead?
The system itself has a mechanism. Anyone can call a Code Lavender, and it automatically triggers a formalized response. Trained peer responders arrive, guided meditation is offered, operational coverage is temporarily provided.
So it bypasses the manager entirely?
Completely. It operates independently of a manager's observation skills. It is a systemic boundary that activates to protect the employee's neurobiology the exact moment the environment demands it.
That is a fascinating mechanism. And I mean, it certainly provides immediate relief. But I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective.
All right, let's hear it.
Treating a structural support program like Code Lavender as a substitute for compassionate leadership is it's like installing a highly sophisticated sprinkler system in a building where the chief architect carelessly leaves oily rags and lit matches everywhere.
Okay, a bit dramatic, but I follow.
But it's true. The sprinkler system might activate automatically. It might put out the immediate fire and provide temporary relief to the burned employee. But the leader's behavior is what is creating the persistent hazard in the first place. By focusing on the structural net, you are treating the symptom while completely ignoring the arsonist.
But if the architect is the one leaving oily rags everywhere, why are we trusting that exact same architect to suddenly develop the emotional intelligence to stop doing it?
Because if they don't, you hold them accountable from the top down, and that brings us to the reality of how you stop active toxicity.
Okay.
When a culture is deeply dysfunctional, reversing it requires highly visible top-down leadership accountability. Systems and structural nets do not fire toxic managers. Senior leaders do. Consider Uber's crisis intervention back in 2017.
Right, following the massive public exposure of their cultural dysfunction.
Yes, the rampant sexual harassment, the retaliation, that intense tech bro culture. To break those entrenched norms, Uber couldn't just, install a new peer support system or an anonymous tip line. The toxicity was way too deep.
So they brought in external help.
Exactly. They brought in former Attorney General Eric Holder to conduct an independent investigation. But the key was the result. It was an explicit 47-point public recommendation plan.
Which was quite sweeping, as I recall.
Very. It spanned board oversight, leadership accountability, strict HR processes. And the reason it worked as an intervention was that it was driven by the absolute highest levels of authority. Leaders who didn't comply were simply removed.
Sure, but
Systems only carry weight if senior leaders are explicitly bound by them and publicly enforce them. True accountability has to cascade from the top.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
I understand the appeal of the dramatic turnaround, but relying on top-down investigations like Uber's is actually a reactive, crisis-stage failure.
A failure? It fixed the company.
Think about it, though. By the time you were bringing in a former attorney general to write a 47-point plan, the damage to your emotionally intelligent talent has already been done. They have already burned out or they have already quit.
Well, that's fair. It is late in the game.
Accountability shouldn't require a catastrophic public failure and a board-level panic to activate. It should be distributed dynamically throughout the organization's daily workflows. Take a look at W.L. Gore's fluid leadership model.
Oh, the material science company? The ones who make Gore-Tex? They operate on a completely different paradigm.
They do, and it is highly effective at preventing toxicity. They operate with a deliberately flat, lattice structure where leadership is fluid. Associates actually choose the leaders they commit to following rather than having managers just assigned to them by HR.
Right. It's very unique.
But think about the mechanics of what that does to toxicity. It makes it naturally self-correcting. If a leader starts exhibiting destructive, toxic behavior, if they yell, hoard information, demean their team, they simply find themselves without followers. Exactly. People stop putting them on projects. The toxicity is starved of oxygen immediately, at the root level, without needing a massive top-down investigation or an executive to notice. The structure itself filters out bad actors.
That is a beautiful concept in theory. But, if you are listening to this and you work at a traditional hospital or a legacy bank or like a manufacturing firm, you are probably rolling your eyes right now.
Why? It works.
Because you are pointing to a highly bespoke organizational model that W.L. Gore built from the ground up over decades. It is simply not scalable to most legacy organizations.
I don't know if I agree it's impossible.
When the standard corporate structure, an employee's ability to simply choose a different leader is structurally impossible. If you are a junior financial analyst, you cannot just declare to HR that you are no longer following the vice president of your division because they lack emotional intelligence.
Well, obviously not overnight, but
Because we operate in realities where strict hierarchy exists. Top-down enforcement remains the only realistic lever for swift remediation. You need a senior executive to step in and say, this behavior ends today.
But doesn't that just prove my point? If the hierarchy makes it impossible for employees to protect themselves from a toxic manager, the hierarchy is the problem.
Well, sure, but you can't just wish it away.
We should be redesigning the workflows and decision rights to reduce that unnecessary interdependence, rather than just crossing our fingers and hoping a benevolent senior executive swoops in to save the day.
Redesigning workflows is important, absolutely. But who redesigns them? It requires continuous learning systems driven by leadership to sustain it. If we are talking about building long-term cultural resilience so that these high EI employees can actually thrive, the solution is forcing leaders to view cultural health with the exact same urgency they view financial health.
Okay, I agree with that in principle.
Let's look at how Costco operates. They are in the retail warehouse industry, which is notoriously ruthless. High turnover, low employee investment.
Yet they consistently maintain a distinctively positive culture and, really high retention.
Exactly. And the mechanism behind that is what matters. MIT researcher Zainab Tan points out that Costco's senior leadership treats cultural metrics, things like employee satisfaction, promotion from within rates, voluntary turnover, as hard operational key performance indicators.
So they treat it like sales data.
Exactly. When those metrics show a concerning trend in a specific region, leadership investigates the root causes with the same intensity they would bring to a massive drop in sales. They don't just rely on a passive structure to fix it.
But they are using structural data.
They use the structural data to alert the leadership, who are then held accountable for taking action. Long-term resilience only happens when leadership treats culture as a non-negotiable operational metric.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that true resilience is best achieved when the physical and relational infrastructure physically forces healthy behavior?
Forcing behavior?
Yes, removing the burden from leadership review meetings entirely. If you design the environment correctly, the healthy behavior becomes unavoidable.
Walk me through how physical infrastructure achieves that.
Okay, look at the mechanics of Pixar Animation Studios' original headquarters. Ed Catmull and his team designed the building specifically to maximize unplanned interaction among employees from completely different functions.
The famous atrium design, right?
Yes, they put the mailboxes, the primary cafeteria, and the main meeting rooms in a central atrium that everyone, from animators to accountants to executives, had to pass through multiple times a day.
Just to force them to bump into each other?
Exactly. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was an architectural mechanism. It structurally forced cross-functional collisions. You build relational trust through repeated, informal contact.
I see.
The building itself did the heavy lifting of culture building, breaking down silos without a manager ever having to, schedule a mandatory team-building exercise.
Physical architecture is undeniably powerful for building trust. I'll give you that. But it doesn't solve the power dynamics in a high-stakes meeting. If a room is toxic, an atrium won't save the junior designer getting torn apart by a senior director.
But structural processes absolutely can solve power dynamics in those exact meetings.
Like what?
Consider IDEO, the global design consultancy. They use a formal procedural mechanism called ritual dissent.
Ritual dissent? That sounds intense.
It's brilliant. When a team member presents an idea that is under development, their peers are explicitly invited to critique it. But here's the critical rule. The presenting designer is structurally required to remain entirely silent during the feedback. They can only listen and take notes.
Oh, which prevents them from defending the idea in real time and getting defensive.
Exactly. Think about the neurobiology of a standard critique. Normally, when someone attacks your work, your fight or flight response triggers, right?
Definitely.
But the rule of silence forces the brain to bypass those defensive posturing mechanisms. It is a structural inversion of traditional power dynamics. The presenter becomes vulnerable, but the critics are forced to be objective rather than combative.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right? It guarantees honest feedback without damaging relationships, which fundamentally protects the high EI employee from the interpersonal gauntlets you see in toxic cultures. The psychological safety isn't reliant on the manager being nice. The safety is baked into the rules of the meeting.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently.
How so?
It is genuinely a fascinating mechanism for lowering the temperature in a room. But let's look at the reality of how that rule actually exists. Even in IDEO's case, a leader had to possess the profound emotional intelligence to establish that ritual in the first place.
Well, initially, sure.
And they have to fiercely protect it every single day. Infrastructure does not build itself, and it certainly doesn't enforce itself. It requires an architect.
But once it's built,
If a toxic, ego-driven leader takes over that ideal team, they can simply abolish the ritual descent rule because the silence makes them uncomfortable. The structure is only as permanent as the leader's willingness to uphold it.
I would counter that in a truly mature culture, the structure becomes larger than the individual. If a new leader tried to abolish a protective mechanism like ritual descent, the organizational immune system would reject that leader. The team would revolt because they recognize the value of the system.
Well, this has been a deeply illuminating exchange. We are circling a vital question about how modern organizations protect their most relationally capable, highly attuned talent.
It's a critical issue for any organization today.
It is. And I maintain my position that compassionate, accountable leadership is the indispensable architect of a healthy culture. Without a human leader actively noticing the static in the room, feeling the impact it has on their people, and taking decisive action, the best systems in the world easily devolve into performative bureaucracy.
And I remain convinced that distributed, leader-agnostic structures are the only true fail-safe against organizational toxicity. We simply cannot leave the neurobiological safety of highly sensitive professionals up to the emotional lottery of who happens to manage them on any given day.
The emotional lottery, yeah.
Exactly. We need measurable safety, anonymous channels, and structural inversions of power to protect them systemically.
Despite our different approaches to the intervention, I think we have arrived at a very powerful point of convergence based on Dr. Westover's research.
I agree.
We both agree on a fundamental truth here. High emotional intelligence is a neurobiological reality and an essential organizational capability. It is not a weakness to be managed, and it is certainly not a flaw to be suppressed.
Absolutely. The depth of emotional processing, the empathic absorption, these are the exact mechanisms that drive trust, candor, and collaborative problem solving.
Right.
When highly attuned individuals suffer in toxic environments, it is a structural incompatibility, not an individual failure. As the research notes, their struggle is not evidence of their inadequacy. It is evidence of an environment unworthy of their capabilities.
Which really reframes the entire concept of turnover. When you see emotionally intelligent talent fleeing an organization, it is not just a standard retention issue for HR to log.
No, not at all.
It is an organization's immune system signaling a terminal threat to its relational infrastructure. When those highly sensitive sensors start burning out, it means the rest of the building is in grave danger.
Exactly. The people who feel most deeply are the ones holding the invisible fabric of the culture together. If an organization fails to protect them, it slowly drains away its capacity for genuine human connection, leaving behind just a brittle shell where only the appearance of performance remains.
Well said. So the question left for you, our listeners, is whether safeguarding that incredible talent relies on demanding better, more compassionate leaders at the top, or designing smarter, leader-proof systems from the ground up.
There is definitely so much more to explore in the mechanisms of organizational health within this source material.